The M60's starter ground for the fourth time that morning, coughed once, and died into silence. Jake Turner stepped back from the open engine deck, wiping grease from his hands onto his high-visibility vest, and swore under his breath. "This thing's dead," he announced to the two other mechanics standing near the tool cart. The AVDS 1790 diesel had refused every attempt they'd made over the past 3 hours. New batteries installed, fuel lines checked, oil levels verified twice. Colonel Mark Reyes stood near the museum's back door with his arms crossed, watching the morning slip away along with any hope of getting the tank running for next week's Founders Day parade. Hank Mercer stood 15 yards away with a black trash bag in one weathered hand, watching quietly from the edge of the vehicle yard's gravel. He had seen them flood the engine twice and skip the pre-lube sequence entirely. His right knee ached from standing, and he shifted his weight carefully, debating whether anyone would listen if he spoke up. "You're flooding it," Hank said, his voice rough and low. Jake turned, looked him up and down. Faded army field jacket with frayed cuffs, cargo pants held up with a web belt, split-sole work boots, and snorted. "You got a magic fix, old-timer?" He walked over to the tool cart, grabbed a crowbar, and pushed it into Hank's calloused hands. "Here, maybe you can scare it back to life." Two of the public works employees chuckled. Reyes heard the exchange from across the yard and glanced over, his expression tightening slightly at the tone, but uncertain whether to intervene. Hank looked down at the crowbar, then back at the tank's open engine compartment. He stepped forward without raising his voice, limping slightly on his right leg. "You got power on the batteries?" he asked, as Reyes started to say, "Hang on, let's be careful here." The old man climbed onto the M60's hull, crowbar in hand, and moved with sudden purpose toward a specific access panel behind the turret. His hands moved across the engine deck with the practiced familiarity of someone who had opened this exact cover hundreds of times before. Reyes stopped mid-sentence, watching those scarred, oil-stained hands find the right panel immediately. No hesitation. Jake exchanged a confused look with his coworker. Hank wedged the crowbar's flat end into a gap near the fuel control linkage, tested it once, and looked back toward the group with an expression that held no pride, only calm assessment. Reyes felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place. This was not the fumbling of someone guessing. This was muscle memory from decades past, surfacing in a man the colonel had written off as just another homeless veteran who slept behind his building. How did the homeless man everyone mocked know exactly where to put that crowbar? Someone would later ask. And why did the tank respond when nothing else had worked? If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about real courage, quiet skill, and hidden heroes matter to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more true stories that honor veterans who've slipped through the cracks. Now, let's continue. The vehicle yard spread across a quarter-acre of compacted gravel behind the Riverside Veterans Museum, a one-story brick building with a flat roof and simple glass entrance that sat on the eastern edge of town near Route 7. The M60 A3 main battle tank occupied the yard center position, its 60 tons resting on wooden chocks behind both tracks, its faded green and brown camouflage, paint showing patches of surface rust along exposed bolt heads and weld seams. The museum had acquired it 3 years earlier from a depot sale, and Colonel Reyes had spent most of that time arranging permits and insurance to move it occasionally under its own power for educational demonstrations and memorial events. The Founders Day parade next Saturday represented his first chance to show the community their restored armor running, not just sitting static behind a chain-link fence. The early May morning had warmed quickly, and volunteers had shed jackets by 9 o'clock. A rolling tool chest sat open near the tank's rear, displaying an array of sockets, wrenches, and specialized implements for working on heavy machinery. A hydraulic jack and stands waited nearby, along with approved fuel containers, a portable air compressor, and a white City Public Works pickup truck with an orange light bar parked at the yard's edge. Lexi Harris, the 19-year-old museum intern, carried folding chairs and laminated safety signs from the building's storage room, setting them up for the expected crowd of local reporters and city officials who would arrive later to photograph the tank's first movement in decades. The smell of old grease mixed with diesel residue and dust hung in the still air. Distant traffic hummed from the highway. A crow called from the power line overhead. Jake Turner represented the city's contribution to the project, a diesel mechanic with 7 years' experience on trucks and construction equipment, assigned to help because the city hoped to use the museum's success as a public relations opportunity. He had approached the tank with confidence 3 days earlier, assessed its systems with the eye of someone used to solving mechanical problems, and assured Colonel Reyes that getting the AVDS 1790 running would be straightforward. This morning had proven him wrong. The engine turned over but refused to catch, and his frustration showed in the tightness of his jaw and the force with which he set down tools. His 2 colleagues from the Public Works garage stood back, deferring to his lead, occasionally glancing at their phones to check the time. Hank Mercer had been present since dawn. He slept most nights under an overhang on the building's north side, out of sight from the main parking lot, using a rolled sleeping bag and keeping his few possessions in a surplus duffel bag tucked against the brick wall. Over the past 2 weeks, since seeing the volunteer flyer at the church basement meal, he had lingered increasingly near the tank restoration work, picking up discarded zip ties and rags, moving empty fuel containers to the trash, watching the younger mechanics work with an expression that revealed nothing. His face showed every one of his 76 years, narrow and weathered, with deep lines around his mouth and across his forehead, a slight flattening at the bridge of his nose from an old break, and a faint jagged scar running from his left cheekbone toward his jaw. His hair remained mostly gray with scattered darker strands. Kept short in an uneven high-end tight style, he maintained himself with cheap clippers when he could afford batteries. Light blue eyes, faded but alert, tended to squint as if still scanning for movement at a distance. His hands told their own story. Thick-knuckled, bearing old burn marks on the backs and small white scars along the fingers, nails trimmed short and perpetually stained with oil or grime for whatever mechanical work he found. His build remained about 5'9", shoulders still broad, but his frame thinned by 18 years of inconsistent meals, though the muscles in his forearms and calves stayed defined from constant walking and manual labor. He moved with a slight limp in his right leg, stepping carefully when first standing, then settling into a steady measured pace that retained a faint military straightness in his posture despite everything that had worn him down. The field jacket, cargo pants, and split-sole work boots completed a picture of a man existing on society's margins, invisible to most people who passed through the museum grounds. Now, standing on the tank's hull with the crowbar in his hands, Hank straightened slightly, and Jake saw something change in his bearing. Not dramatic, but present. The old man asked again, "You got power on the batteries?" And this time his voice carried a different quality, something firm and commanding that made Jake hesitate before responding with sarcasm. Colonel Reyes answered instead. "We do. Verified this morning." He stepped closer to the tank, curiosity overriding his usual caution about safety protocols. Something about the way Hank positioned himself on the hull, the confidence in his movements despite the obvious frailty of age and homelessness, pulled at Reyes's attention. The colonel had spent 23 years in armor units, commanded an M1A1 Abrams company in peacetime, and studied armored warfare history extensively since taking the museum director position. He recognized competence when he saw it, regardless of packaging. Hank nodded once at Reyes's confirmation. He reached the corner of the engine deck he'd been moving toward and used the crowbar to lever open a panel, exposing mechanical linkages beneath. He tested one with his fingers, felt resistance, then repositioned the crowbar's flat end against a specific point and applied careful pressure. "Hit the starter," he said, not loudly, but with absolute clarity of instruction. Jake hesitated, glancing at Colonel Reyes. The colonel nodded. "Give him a switch." On the next attempt, the starter's sound changed, still grinding, but with a different pitch that made Hank tilt his head, listening. He signaled them to stop with a raised hand. "Your fuel rack's sticking," he said, addressing the group without looking down from the hull. "You've been trying to start on a dead position. Crowbar's not for hitting things." It's removing this linkage without putting your hand where it doesn't belong if the engine catches unexpected. Jake's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance. And how would you know that? Hank's reply came without emotion or pride. I used to keep these running when they had people's lives riding on them. Lexi, standing near the museum door with her clipboard, noticed Colonel Reyes's reaction immediately. The way his eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in the manner of someone mentally reaching for a detail that suddenly fit into an incomplete picture. The colonel's gaze dropped to Hank's jacket sleeve, where the frayed cuff revealed the edge of an old tattoo on the man's left upper arm. Black and green ink, the lines blurred but unmistakably depicting some kind of military insignia and numbers. Reyes stepped closer to the tank, close enough now that he could see Hank's face clearly in the morning light, and the question formed before he fully processed why it mattered. What unit were you with? The old man paused, his hands still positioned on the crowbar and linkage, and for 3 seconds everyone in the yard watched him decide whether to answer. Hank Mercer hadn't always been the man sleeping behind the museum, existing in the narrow spaces between charity meals and odd repair jobs that paid in cash or gift cards. In 1967, he had been an 18-year-old with a fresh enlistment contract, his head shaved to stubble, his boots still stiff, standing in a motor pool at Fort Knox with the summer sun beating down on asphalt that shimmered with heat. He'd scored high on the mechanical aptitude battery during processing and received assignment as a 63 A-track vehicle mechanic, specializing in the powertrains and systems of armored vehicles. He learned the M48 patent first, then transitioned to the newer M60 as it entered service, studying the AVDS 1790-2 diesel engine until he could disassemble and reassemble major components blindfolded during training exercises designed to simulate field repairs under combat conditions. By 1968, Specialist Mercer had deployed to Vietnam with Company B, 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment, initially attached to operations with the 25th Infantry Division. The Army needed mechanics who could keep tanks operational in the heat, humidity, and red dust of Southeast Asia, where engine oil turned to sludge, air filters clogged within hours, and transmission seals failed under constant strain. Hank proved capable beyond his years, diagnosing problems other mechanics missed, improvising repairs when proper parts waited weeks in supply chains, and maintaining a reputation for never exaggerating a prognosis. If he said a tank would run, it ran. If he said it needed a day down for maintenance, you gave it the day. His primary military occupational specialty evolved from pure mechanic into tank commander when his platoon lost an NCO, and his technical knowledge, combined with calm decision-making under pressure, made him the logical choice for promotion to sergeant and assignment to Command Steel 3, the third tank in the platoon's radio call sign sequence. The nickname Steel 3 started as simple radio procedure: Steel 1 for the platoon leader, Steel 2 for the wingman, Steel 3 for Hank's position in the formation, but took on additional meaning during a convoy escort mission in August 1968 along Route 13, the stretch of road north of Lai Key that American soldiers called Thunder Road for the frequency and intensity of ambushes it attracted. A resupply convoy of approximately 20 fuel trucks, ambulances, and freight vehicles moved north under tank escort when a roadside bomb disabled the lead truck and small arms fire erupted from both flanks. A second explosion stalled a vehicle in the column's center, creating a bottleneck that trapped slower trucks under increasingly accurate enemy fire. Radio traffic devolved into overlapping shouts and incomplete reports. Hank, commanding from Steel 3's position at the convoy's rear, saw the situation developing and requested permission to push forward. The convoy commander, overwhelmed and unable to get a clear picture of the road ahead, gave quick approval. Hank maneuvered his M48 off the road shoulder, carefully calculated how much force the disabled truck's frame could withstand, and used the tank's mass to nudge it just far enough to create a lane while his crew maintained suppressive coaxial machine gun fire into the tree line. The convoy resumed movement. Approximately 60 personnel cleared the kill zone with no killed-in-action casualties, though several wounded were treated at the destination firebase. The after-action report credited his tank positioning and mechanical judgment, knowing precisely how far to push without snapping critical components, with preventing a mass casualty event. Over the radio during the chaos, a shaken infantry lieutenant had transmitted, "Steel 3 is keeping the steel moving for us," and the phrase stuck. Hank repeated it to his crew afterward as a simple standard. Tanks existed to move and protect people, not to stall and expose them to enemy fire. The motto became his working philosophy through subsequent operations, maintaining equipment preventatively, pushing through mechanical difficulties when the mission required it, but never recklessly, always with calculation and clear explanation to his crew and commanders about risks and capabilities. By 1970, he held the rank of staff sergeant and commanded Steel 3 with a permanent crew that included his driver, loader, and gunner. Specialist 4 Luis Miguel Ortega, a 22-year-old from El Paso, Texas, who had arrived in country the same month as Hank and had become his closest friend through months of shared danger and off-duty cigarettes. Then came a 12th, 1970, and a narrow dirt road in the approaches to the A Shao Valley that local maps designated as a route toward a small firebase troops informally called Camp Harris. Hank's platoon escorted a mixed column, 2 M60 tanks, several M113 armored personnel carriers, and supply trucks loaded with ammunition and water for the firebase garrison. The mission plan was straightforward. Daylight movement with tanks leading and trailing, APCs dispersed between them, trucks protected in the center. Steel 3 took the lead position. The weather that morning was hot and oppressively humid, with patchy low clouds that made the air along the road feel thick and still. Recent overnight rain had left the ground slick in ruts where vehicle tracks crossed. Visibility extended only to the road surface and the wall of thick jungle pressing close on both sides, occasionally breaking where vegetation thinned enough to see perhaps 20 yards into the trees. They were approximately 20 minutes from the firebase when the first indication came, a muffled thump beneath the second vehicle in line, followed by the sharp crack of metal dislodged under explosive force. Hank caught the surge of dust and smoke in his rearview periscope, felt the concussion wave hit his chest before he heard the sound, as an explosion lifted the back end of the following APC and sent debris spinning into the humid air. He heard the vehicle's driver shout over the radio, voice clipped and loud with surprise and pain. Then the transmission cut off. Before he could fully process what was happening, RPG flashes appeared in the tree line to the right. Brief orange blooms followed by smoke trails that tracked across his field of vision, and a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the side of a truck further back, punching through the cab with a blast that sent burning fuel and splintered wood crates cascading across the road. Small arms fire erupted from both sides simultaneously, a chaotic mix of AK-47 bursts and occasional single shots that cracked through the air and sparked off armor. The smell hit him instantly, diesel exhaust mixing with powder smoke and the thick, acrid stench of burning rubber and plastic. Hank shouted orders to traverse right and return fire. He heard Ortega's voice respond immediately, calm and professional despite the chaos. "On it, Sarge." The turret swung smoothly, and the coaxial machine gun opened up in short controlled bursts directed at likely firing positions identified by muzzle flashes in the jungle. The radio filled with overlapping transmissions. "Truck hit. I'm wounded. Need medic. Contact left. Contact left." That made coherent command nearly impossible. Then the world exploded directly beneath Steel 3's right front quarter as an anti-tank mine or buried charge detonated with crushing force. The shock wave threw Hank hard against the commander's hatch rim, the impact driving air from his lungs and filling his mouth with the sharp metallic taste of blood from a bitten tongue. Metal shrieked as the right track assembly sagged and the front corner dropped. Inside the turret, stored equipment clanged against bulkheads, and a fuse panel popped loose, spilling acrid smoke. Dust and grit blew up through every gap in the turret basket. The tank lurched to a complete halt at an angle, nose slightly down, right front corner sunk into the crater the blast had created. Through the ringing in his ears, Hank heard Ortega's voice again, this time strained and tight with pain. "I'm hit. Sarge, I can't feel my legs." Drop a comment if you've ever worked on engines, vehicles, or equipment, military or civilian. Sometimes the people who keep things running never get their stories told. Now back to the story. Hank climbed down into the turret, moving awkwardly in the cramped space made worse by the tank's angle and the smoke still clearing from blown fuses. Ortega slumped in the gunner's seat, his hands pressed against his lower abdomen, where his uniform showed dark spreading stains. Shrapnel from the underbelly blast had penetrated up through the turret basket's thin bottom plate, tearing into his lower body with fragments that had done catastrophic damage. Hank could see immediately was beyond field treatment. He grabbed field dressings from the storage compartment, pressed them against the worst of the visible wounds, and tried to elevate Ortega's upper body while simultaneously watching through the vision blocks for incoming threats. Another RPG impacted the hull side armor, the shaped charge's jet penetrating partway through before dissipating, but the concussion rocked the tank and made Ortega cry out. "Don't let them take the tank, Sarge," Ortega managed, his voice already weakening. Hank called repeatedly over the radio for a medic, knowing even as he did that extraction under the current fire was impossible without additional support. The ambush lasted approximately 23 minutes from first detonation to the arrival of relief elements, a reaction force from the firebase that had heard the radio traffic and moved immediately. During those minutes, Hank alternated between trying to keep pressure on Ortega's wounds and directing the loader and driver to maintain defensive fire with the Cokes and the M2.50 caliber machine gun mounted at the commander's position. Ortega's breathing slowed gradually despite everything Hank did. About 15 minutes into the engagement, while Hank was half exposed through the commander's hatch trying to identify targets for suppressive fire, he heard the breathing stop. He looked down and saw Ortega's eyes fixed and unfocused, and knew. He stayed at his position, continuing to direct fire because 5 other people had died in that ambush. Private First Class Tom grilly killed by small arms fire while riding on an APC's rear deck. Sergeant Paul Kim killed when the RPG penetrated his truck's cab. And 2 more soldiers from the disabled APC, whose names Hank later learned were Corporal James Wu and Private Daniel Torres, both killed in the initial blast. And his job remained keeping the tank operational enough to protect whoever was still alive behind him. Shrapnel fragments lodged in Hank's right thigh and knee during the mine blast, pieces too deep for field extraction. He sustained a concussion from the impact against the hatch that left him with temporary hearing loss and persistent ringing in his right ear. Despite these injuries, when medevac helicopters finally reached the site under escort, he refused immediate evacuation and assisted in loading 2 wounded soldiers from other vehicles before a medic physically insisted he board. They took him to a field hospital where surgeons removed some, but not all of the shrapnel from his leg. The pieces near major blood vessels and nerves remained too dangerous to extract without better facilities and would stay embedded in his flesh for the rest of his life. Within 24 hours of surgery, he asked repeatedly about Ortega and was finally told his gunner had died before reaching medical treatment. Hank had kept Ortega's wristwatch, a simple stainless steel watch with a scratched crystal face that the dying man had pressed into his hand with instructions to give it to Maria in a small cloth pouch with his personal effects. The descent from that moment took years to complete, a slow erosion rather than a sudden collapse. Hank returned to duty on limited status, experiencing frequent nightmares where he was back in the turret with Ortega, hearing the same radio transmissions and smelling the same combination of diesel and burning rubber, waking up sweating with his heart racing and convinced momentarily that he was still under fire. Flashbacks triggered by sudden loud noises, vehicle backfires, dropped equipment, door slams, made his body react before conscious thought, dropping into defensive postures or clenching into fists. He began avoiding supply trucks because the sight of fuel and ammunition loads triggered vivid recall of the burning vehicles. His headaches became chronic. His knee pain never fully resolved. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, responding to jokes with forced smiles that didn't reach his eyes. There were incidents, slamming his fist into a barracks wall when someone made a casual remark about tanks being easy targets, shouting at a new lieutenant who suggested pushing faster through a risky area without proper reconnaissance. After each incident, he apologized, but the pattern established itself in ways that worried his peers and superiors. He completed his active service commitment and returned stateside in the mid-1970s, joining an Army Reserve armor unit while trying to build civilian life. He married Denise in 1976, a woman who knew he had served in Vietnam, but only gradually understood the extent of his difficulties. At first, his silence and occasional nighttime restlessness seemed manageable. Over time, his irritability increased in ways neither of them fully understood. At a 4th of July event in 1978, unexpected fireworks caused him to flinch hard and move quickly behind a parked vehicle, breathing hard and scanning for threats, while their 2-year-old daughter, Emily, cried at seeing her father's frightened reaction. One night, during a thunderstorm in 1981, a particularly loud thunderclap woke him from a nightmare, and he shouted orders in his sleep, shoving Denise's arm away hard when she tried to wake him, not striking her, but with enough force to scare them both. He worked for years as a mechanic at a commercial truck depot, reliable and detail-focused, rarely making mistakes on repairs. As his sleep worsened and knee pain increased, he began showing up late some mornings, especially after nights with intense nightmares. The final termination came in 1998 after a supervisor rushed him to clear a truck for service without completing a full safety checklist. Hank responded sharply, refusing to sign off until every item was checked, and their argument escalated until he shouted and slammed a clipboard onto the concrete floor with enough force to crack it. Combined with previous tardiness warnings, the incident led to his firing. He attempted to find similar work at other garages, but references proved difficult, and age began working against him. His marriage reached its breaking point around 2002 after a series of short-term jobs and increasing conflict about finances and his behavior. One evening, after an argument about overdue bills, Denise told him she was considering a separation. Their daughter, by then a teenager, stayed in her room, avoiding the conflict entirely. Hank felt he had become a liability rather than support. The divorce finalized within a year. He moved into a rented room, then bounced between temporary housing and unemployed periods. The surrender moment came approximately 18 years before the present, sometime in 2006. Standing outside a low-rent apartment building with an eviction notice and his possessions reduced to a duffel bag and 2 cardboard boxes, he decided not to call his ex-wife or daughter. He told himself he would not drag them into his problems. He stored 1 box with a neighbor temporarily, took the duffel and remaining box, and walked toward the downtown area where he knew shelters and churches operated. He chose not to say goodbye to Emily directly, justifying it as protecting her from seeing him at his lowest point. He kept the duffel with some clothes, a small cloth pouch containing his dog tags and Ortega's watch and a few photographs, and his old field jacket. He left behind furniture, most household items, and unit plaques he could not carry. For 18 years, he survived on the margins, lining up at church meal programs, doing occasional day labor moving furniture or sweeping parking lots, collecting cans and scrap metal for recycling, and stretching a small VA disability check that barely covered basic supplies. In recent years, he stayed mostly in Riverside, a medium-sized town with a small VA clinic and a veterans museum. He slept first under an overpass near Route 7, then found the overhang behind the museum building where staff saw him often enough to tolerate his presence as long as he caused no trouble. A church volunteer named Carl occasionally gave him simple mechanic jobs on the church van, paying in cash or gift cards. A nurse from the VA clinic helped him refill medications when he came in, though he sometimes skipped appointments. He never sold Ortega's watch or his dog tags, even when short on food, and kept his field jacket even when he could have traded it for weather-appropriate clothing, because the jacket had extra pockets and he knew how to use it in various conditions. 2 weeks before the tank incident, he saw a flyer taped near the coffee urn at a church basement meal. Volunteers needed. M60 Tank Restoration Project. Help us get our historic M60A3 ready to roll for the Founders Day Parade. Mechanical experience helpful, but not required. See Colonel Ret. Mark Reyes at Riverside Veterans Museum, Vehicle Yard. He took note of the words M60 and ready to roll. The M60 was his platform. Even after decades, he remembered the engine sounds, starting procedure, common faults. The idea of helping bring one back to operating condition appealed to his sense of competence in a way nothing else had in years. He walked from the church to the museum the next morning, about half a mile, his knee hurting enough that he stopped once to sit on a low wall. When he arrived, he watched from outside the fence first, seeing younger volunteers and a city maintenance truck parked near the tank. Over the following days, he hovered at the edges, picking up trash or moving tools when asked, answering direct questions with short replies, but never mentioning his past. By the day Jake handed him the crowbar, he had been around the project enough that volunteers knew him only as the homeless guy out back who helps clean up. Hank finished adjusting the linkage with the crowbar, then directed them through the proper starting sequence in clear, specific steps. "Confirm fuel lines are bled," he said. Jake checked and confirmed. "Batteries solid?" Reyes answered affirmatively from his position near the hull. "Throttle set to start position, not running position." Jake adjusted it. "Now execute the pre-lube cycle. You need oil circulating before combustion or you'll score bearings, even if it catches." They followed his instructions exactly. On the next attempt, with the linkage freed and the procedure correct, the starter ground once, twice, then the deep, unmistakable rumble of the AVDS 1790 diesel caught and stabilized. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust outlets. The idle settled into the characteristic heavy throb that made the hull vibrate under Hank's boots, a sensation he had not felt in over 40 years, but recognized instantly in his muscles and bones. Volunteers stepped back, several of them staring at the running engine with obvious surprise. Jake's jaw tightened as he looked from the tank to Hank and back, unable to argue with the evidence of an engine that had refused to start all morning until the old homeless man positioned a crowbar and gave specific technical instructions. Lexi stood frozen with her clipboard, eyes wide, recognizing this was not luck or coincidence, but knowledge applied with precision. Colonel Reyes felt his own posture shift, his military bearing reasserting itself as his brain began processing implications. This was not someone guessing based on general mechanical aptitude. This was someone who had started M60 engines many times before, someone who knew the exact linkage to check and the correct sequence to follow. Over the engine's steady rumble, Reyes called up to Hank, his voice carrying the weight of a question that had moved from curiosity to professional interest. "What did you say your unit was?" This time Hank had to decide whether to answer fully and risk everything that came with being truly seen after 18 years of deliberate invisibility. What would you do in this situation? If you saw someone being mocked, but then solved the problem nobody else could, would you speak up, apologize, or stay quiet? Comment below with how you think you'd react. Now back to the story. With the engine idling at a steady 800 RPM, Hank carefully climbed down from the hull, his right leg stiff from the extended period standing on the sloped surface. The crowbar rested beside the now-closed panel. He met Colonel Reyes's eyes and answered without theatrics or pride. "B Company, 1st Battalion, 69th Armor. Vietnam." Reyes repeated the unit designation quietly. One of 69 AR, his mind already reaching for connections to unit histories he had read during his years studying armored warfare. The 69th Armor had a long heritage, but its Vietnam service remained less famous than some other units, known primarily within armor circles for specific actions rather than popular consciousness. He asked the follow-up question that would confirm or dispel his growing suspicion. "Call sign?" Hank hesitated, understanding that answering this question would open doors he had kept closed for decades. Finally, he said, "Steel 3 actual back then." The colonel's expression changed completely. His eyes widened fractionally, and he went very still, the kind of stillness that comes when a person suddenly realizes they are standing in the presence of someone or something significant they had failed to recognize. He knew that call sign. He had read it in after-action reports, seen it referenced in unit histories, encountered it in archive documents about armored operations in I Corps and II Corps during 1968 through 1971. He specifically remembered a summary about Route 13 convoy escort and another about Firebase ripcord support operations that mentioned a tank commander named Staff Sergeant Mercer improvising repairs under fire and making decisions that saved lives. He had not expected that name to belong to the homeless man who slept behind his building and picked up trash in a vehicle yard. Harold Mercer? Reyes asked, his voice tight. Yes, sir, Hank confirmed. Around them, the small group of volunteers and workers went completely quiet. The engine continued its steady rumble, but human voices stopped. Jake stood with a wrench still in his hand, looking between Hank and the colonel with confusion beginning to shift toward uncomfortable realization. Lexi gripped her clipboard tighter, sensing she was witnessing something important even if she did not fully understand the context. The two other public works employees stopped pretending to organize tools and simply watched. Reyes stepped back half a pace, visibly processing information and comparing it to memory. Years of military bearing and composure showed in how he controlled his reaction, but people who knew him could see he was shaken. I read about you, he said carefully. There's a ripcord support report with your tank in it. You improvised an oil pump repair under fire, so you could reach an infantry unit under attack. And there's an after-action report from Route 13 with "Keep the Steel Moving" in quotation marks. They attributed it to the tank commander of Steel 3 who pushed a disabled truck out of a kill zone. The phrase, "keep the steel moving," landed in the morning air like a physical object. Hank responded reflexively, his voice rough. That was some lieutenant's line first. It stuck with us afterward. Reyes turned slightly to address the group, his tone shifting into the clear explanatory mode he used when giving museum tours or briefings. Steel 3 was known in certain armor circles. Not famous like some units, but known among tankers who study Vietnam operations. The actions colonel, he called himself, Staff Sergeant Mercer's tank was involved and are still discussed in some armor courses as examples of field maintenance under fire and sound tactical judgment. He did not exaggerate or embellish. He simply stated facts as he knew them from documented sources. Jake looked to Hank differently now, his face showing the uncomfortable expression of someone replaying recent behavior and recognizing how poorly they had acted. The mocking comment about the crowbar, the sarcastic tone, the dismissive assumption that a homeless man could not possibly know more than he did about diesel engines. All of it sat heavily in the space between them. Reyes made a decision. We're going inside, he said, gesturing toward the museum office. I want to see your records, Mr. Mercer. With your permission. It was phrased as a request, showing respect, but both men understood it was also the beginning of a process that would either confirm or refute everything that had just been implied. Hank nodded once, understanding that his anonymity was ending whether he wanted it to or not. Inside the museum office, a modest space with a desk, computer, filing cabinets, and walls covered with framed photographs and unit insignia, Colonel Reyes sat down and opened a browser window connected to military records databases he had access to as a museum director and retired officer. Hank sat across from him in a plastic chair, hands resting on his knees, visibly uncomfortable indoors after years of living primarily outside. The air conditioning felt strange on his skin. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. Reyes typed Harold J. Mercer into the search field along with approximate birth year, 1947 or 1948, and unit designation 169th AR. The database queried for several seconds, then returned results. Service record confirmed. Enlisted 1967, MOS 63/63E, Vietnam service 1968 to 1971, rank at Separation Staff Sergeant E6. Awards and decorations listed included Bronze Star Medal with V device for Valor, Army Commendation Medal, Good Conduct Medal, Vietnam Service Medal with Campaign Stars, and several others. Reyes clicked through to scan documents and found excerpts of after-action reports, unit rosters, and citations. He printed relevant pages rather than relying on memory, wanting physical documentation. One page showed a paragraph describing a convoy escort on Route 13 in August 1968 where SSG Mercer's tank maneuvered to clear a disabled vehicle and maintain suppressive fire while the convoy completed movement through the engagement area. Another described a fire-based ripcord support operation in July 1970, where the tank commander executed field maintenance on a critical engine component under hostile fire, allowing the vehicle to reach an infantry unit requiring armored support. The language was dry and official, but the meaning was clear. This man had done exceptional things under extreme conditions. Reyes pulled out physical binders the museum kept, compiled over years from various sources, including donated materials and copied military archives. He found a section on Vietnam-era armor operations and paged through until he located a subsection on 169th AR. There, in faded photocopied text, appeared several references to tanks by call sign, including Steel 3. One paragraph mentioned Steel 3 maintained its position longer than expected, while others repositioned during an engagement. Another noted the tank commander's technical knowledge and judgment under fire prevented potential casualties. While this verification happened inside, Lexi had quietly told Jake and the other workers what she had heard, that the homeless man was a documented tank commander from Vietnam who had apparently done significant things in combat. Jake absorbed the information in silence, then walked back to the tank and looked at the fuel control linkage Hank had freed with the crowbar. He could see now that the mechanical issue had been right there, obvious if you knew exactly where to look and what to check, invisible if you did not. He recognized, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had missed something clear to someone with deeper experience, and had responded to being shown his gap in knowledge by mocking the person who had it. Word spread among museum staff and the few early morning visitors present. Nobody turned it into a spectacle yet. This was still the investigation phase, but there was a shift in how people refer to Hank, changing from that homeless guy to Mr. Mercer in their conversations. Reyes returned from the filing cabinets with printed documents and photocopied pages. He laid them out on the desk in front of Hank and asked him to confirm details. Hank recognized names of his crew members, including Specialist Luis Ortega listed as Kia, May 12, 1970. He saw his own name on the roster and in citations. He pointed to a date and location and said quietly, "That was the Route 13 convoy." He pointed to another and said, "That was the ripcord support run where I fixed the oil pump." Each confirmation was matter of fact, without elaboration. At that moment, the office door opened and a man in his late 40s, wearing a Riverside Fire Department polo shirt and duty pants with a radio clipped to his belt, stepped inside with a folder in his hand. "Colonel Reyes," he said, "you called about a Staff Sergeant Mercer." Michael Ortega had received Reyes's call 20 minutes earlier, made after the colonel had seen the name Ortega in the old records and remembered that a local firefighter named Michael Ortega had mentioned months ago that his uncle had died in Vietnam as a tanker. Colonel Reyes stood and gestured Michael Ortega into the office, then addressed both men carefully. "Mr. Mercer, this is Michael Ortega. Michael, this is Harold Mercer, who served with 1st Battalion, 69th Armor in Vietnam." He paused, then added, "Michael's uncle, Specialist Luis Ortega, also served in that unit." Michael stepped forward, his firefighter's composure firmly in place, but his eyes showing the intensity of someone who had just heard a name connected to family history he had researched for years without finding complete answers. "My uncle Luis was a gunner," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "He was killed in May 1970. My family kept his letters. In several of them, he mentioned his tank commander, Sergeant Mercer, and something about keeping the steel moving." Hank looked at Michael Ortega. The resemblance was there in the shape of the face and the dark eyes, a clear family connection to Luis, and felt something in his chest tighten in a way he had not experienced in many years. "Luis Ortega was my gunner," he said, his rough voice even quieter than usual. "He was killed on May 12, 1970, in an ambush near the A Shao Valley. We hit a mine. Shrapnel came through the turret basket floor." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry I never got this back to your family." He reached into his field jacket pocket, pulled out the small cloth pouch he always kept there, and opened it with stiff fingers. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old bandana material, was the stainless steel wristwatch with its scratched crystal and worn metal band. He held it out. Luis gave me this before he died. He said to give it to Maria. Michael's hands shook slightly as he took the watch. He turned it over, seeing the backplate with some scratches and a small dent. His voice thickened despite his attempt to maintain composure. Maria is my aunt, Luis's younger sister. She never married. She stayed close to our family her whole life. We all grew up hearing about Uncle Luis. He looked up from the watch to meet Hank's eyes. My mother, his other sister, said Luis wrote that his tank commander was the best mechanic in the unit and kept them alive more times than they could count. Michael explained to Colonel Reyes, and by extension, to the story, that his uncle's death had shaped their family in ways large and small. Luis had been 22, the oldest of 4 siblings. His death had devastated his parents, but also galvanized his younger sisters and brother. One sister became a teacher specifically to work with at-risk students, feeling she needed to make a difference in others' lives in honor of the brother who never got to make his own full contribution. His brother, Michael's father, became a police officer. The family built lives, careers, raised children including Michael and his cousins, accumulated grandchildren and later great-grandchildren. They spoke of Luis at family gatherings, kept his photograph in prominent places, and maintained his memory as a presence rather than just an absence. Michael credited stories of his uncle's service with his own decision to become a firefighter, wanting a career where he helped people in immediate, tangible ways, just as his uncle had tried to do. He quantified it plainly. If Uncle Luis had died earlier in the war, before my mother and aunt were old enough to remember him clearly, it would have been different. But he lived 22 years, sent dozens of letters, shaped how his younger siblings saw service and sacrifice. That rippled through our family. I'm here because he was there, and because someone kept him alive as long as possible when things went bad. He looked at Hank. That was you. Hank's voice tightened as he responded. He was a good gunner. Kept us alive more than once. I should have done more to get him out. Michael shook his head. You brought his watch home, even if it took years. That matters to us. It matters to Aunt Maria. The emotional weight in the room was contained but evident. Hank did not weep openly, but his eyes glistened and he looked away for a moment, composing himself. Michael maintained his firefighter's professional bearing, but his hands remained unsteady as he held the watch. Colonel Reyes stood quietly, recognizing this moment was beyond his official role and simply letting it unfold. Lexi, who had followed Michael into the office, witnessed the exchange with wide eyes, suddenly understanding that the morning's events extended far beyond getting an old tank running. Reyes decided within seconds that this could not remain a quiet internal discovery. Later that day, once the tank had cooled and most volunteers and staff were present, he gathered them in the vehicle yard. News had spread through the museum quickly. Staff members had told volunteers had called friends, and by early afternoon, perhaps 30 people stood in an informal semicircle near the M60. Hank stood somewhat apart, uncomfortable with the attention, his field jacket zipped despite the afternoon warmth. Colonel Reyes addressed the group with the clear, projected voice of someone used to briefings and formal addresses. Earlier today, we had trouble getting this M60 started. One of our regular helpers, Mr. Harold Mercer, stepped in and solved a problem we hadn't identified. That deserves our thanks on its own. He paused, letting that sink in. But there's more you should know. He held up the printed documents from the morning's research. Mr. Mercer served as a staff sergeant and tank commander in B Company, 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment, in Vietnam from 1968 through 1971. He's in the official records for specific actions, including a convoy escort on Route 13 in August 1968 and a firebase support operation near Ripcord in July 1970. Some of the stories we reference in our displays here about armored operations in Vietnam, stories about tanks that kept moving when it mattered most, directly involve his tank and his decisions. He mentioned the Bronze Star with V device for valor, the Army Commendation Medal, and the specific documented incidents of moving a disabled truck under fire and executing an emergency engine repair while under attack. This is not folklore or exaggeration, Reyes stated clearly. This is documented in after-action reports, unit records, and official citations. The call sign Steel 3 appears in armor history texts about Vietnam operations. Mr. Mercer was Steel 3 Actual, the tank commander. He let the weight of that settle across the assembled group, watching faces change from curiosity to surprise to respect. Then Reyes gestured to Michael Ortega, standing near the front of the group in his fire department uniform. I'd also like you to meet Michael Ortega, a shift captain with our fire department. Michael stepped forward, holding the folder he had brought with him. Copies of his uncle's letters and photographs his family had preserved for over 50 years. Michael's voice was steady but carried emotion underneath. My uncle, Specialist Luis Ortega, served as a gunner in the same unit. He was killed in action on May 12, 1970. He opened the folder and pulled out a plastic protected letter, holding it up so people could see the faded handwriting. In one of his last letters home, he wrote about his tank commander, Sergeant Mercer. He wrote, "Sarge Mercer says keep the steel moving and we'll make it home." Michael's voice tightened slightly on the last words. He looked at Hank, standing 15 feet away near the tank's hull. "Did you serve with my Uncle Luis?" Hank answered plainly, his rough voice carrying in the quiet yard. "Luis Ortega was my gunner. He was killed in May 1970 during an ambush. We him mine. I'm sorry I never got this back to your family." He pulled out the cloth pouch again, removed the watch, and held it out as he walked the few steps to Michael. "He gave me this before he died. Said to get it to Maria." Michael took the watch with both hands, his professional composure cracking visibly now. His eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. "Maria is my aunt, Luis's sister. She's still alive. She's 74 now. She never married. The family always wondered what happened to his watch. We knew he had one, but it wasn't with his personal effects that came home." He explained to the crowd that his family had built entire lives in the decades since Luis's death. His Aunt Maria became a special education teacher and worked for 38 years. His mother became a social worker. His father became a police officer and served for 31 years before retiring. Between his uncle's siblings, there were eventually 9 children, then 24 grandchildren counting Michael, and now 17 great-grandchildren. "Uncle Luis never got to meet any of us," Michael said, his voice thick. "But his service, his sacrifice, shaped how our family approached life. My father told me stories about how his older brother wanted to serve honorably and protect people. That's why I became a firefighter. That's why my cousin became an army medic." Uncle Luis's influence rippled through generations. He looked back at Hank. "You kept him alive as long as possible. You tried to save him. And you carried his watch for over 50 years when you could have lost it or sold it. You brought him home in the way you could." Hank's voice cracked as he tried to respond. "I should have done it sooner. Should have found your family." Michael shook his head. "You're doing it now. That's what matters." He extended his hand, and Hank shook it, the grip lasting several seconds while both men composed themselves. The emotional reaction rippled through the assembled crowd. The moment was contained. No dramatic music, no stage ceremony, just 2 men connected by death 54 years earlier finally making contact across all that time. But its impact showed clearly. Several volunteers wiped their eyes. Jake stood with his arms crossed, his face showing shame at how he had treated Hank earlier in the morning. Lexi openly cried, not bothering to hide it. Even Colonel Reyes's eyes glistened as he watched. Nobody made elaborate speeches. The power came from the plainness of the exchange. A watch returned, a family connection confirmed, a debt of honor finally paid. After allowing a moment for the emotion to settle, Reyes spoke again, his tone shifting back to the practical. "Mr. Mercer's service and sacrifices are now part of this museum's official record. We'll be adding his name and story to our displays, particularly in connection with the M60 exhibit. But beyond that, I've asked whether he'll allow us to help him access available VA services, including housing programs and PTSD treatment resources." He gestured to a woman standing nearby, Karen Lee, a licensed social worker from the local VA clinic who Reyes had called after confirming Hank's records. Karen stepped forward, professional but kind. "Mr. Mercer, I work with veterans experiencing homelessness. There are specific programs available: transitional housing, case management, medical and mental health treatment. With your permission, I'd like to help you access those services." Hank looked overwhelmed, his usual stoic control slipping. "I don't need," he started, but Michael interrupted gently. "You do need, and you earned it. Let people help." Hank closed his mouth and nodded once, unable to articulate more. The crowd's honor showed in practical ways. People approached to shake his hand. Firm, respectful grips without excessive talking. Jake approached last, his young face showing uncomfortable but genuine remorse. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did this morning. You saw what I missed, and you tried to help, and I was a dick about it. If you're willing to teach me what you know about these systems, I'd appreciate it." Hank nodded, accepting the apology without elaboration. Reyes mentioned privately to Hank that if he had family, they could help facilitate contact, but only with his permission and only if he wanted it. Hank hesitated, then mentioned he had a daughter but had not spoken to her in many years. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. We share real stories like this every week. Stories that don't rely on movie-style drama, but on the quiet, real-life courage and skill of veterans and their families. Now let's see what happened next in Hank's life. After the yard cleared that evening, Colonel Reyes, Michael Ortega, and Karen Lee sat with Hank in a quiet corner of the museum's interior, a small table normally used for educational programs. They worked through basic intake questions: current health status, existing VA records, immediate needs. Hank answered slowly and used to discussing his circumstances in detail. Karen made notes and explained options. There was a veterans transitional housing facility 12 miles away with immediate availability, offering a private room, meals, and on-site case management. Medical screening could happen within days. Mental health providers with combat experience were available at the VA clinic. The process would take time, but the support structure existed if he would use it. Hank consented to a referral for emergency housing that night. Michael offered to drive him there, and Hank accepted after Karen confirmed his duffel bag and belongings behind the museum could be secured temporarily. In Michael's pickup truck, they talked in simple, factual terms about Luis, what he had been like as a gunner, what kind of person he was, how he handled fear. Michael described family stories about Luis as a child and teenager. They talked about firefighting, about mechanical systems, about how the tank engine had sounded when it finally caught that morning. Hank kept his answers short but honest and used to this kind of conversation. That night, Hank slept in a clean bed in a small private room at the transitional housing facility instead of under the museum overhang. The space felt strange, too quiet, too enclosed, the mattress too soft compared to ground and sleeping bag. He lay awake for a long time, disoriented by indoor sounds like air conditioning and distant hallway conversations. But he did not have to worry about weather or personal safety in the same immediate way, and eventually exhaustion pulled him under. 2 weeks later, Hank had established a routine within structure that had not existed for 18 years. Karen had helped him update identification documents, restart a comprehensive VA benefits review based on his full service record, and schedule appointments with a mental health provider, a psychologist named Dr. Richard Torres, who had served as a Navy corpsman and had extensive experience treating combat-related PTSD. Hank attended 3 sessions in the first 2 weeks. He remained cautious with emotional details, but began describing the ambush, Ortega's death, and his years on the street in precise, factual terms. Dr. Torres respected his preference for straightforward language over therapeutic jargon and focused on practical coping strategies and medication review. Physically, Hank received a comprehensive medical evaluation for the first time in many years. His knee showed severe arthritis around the old shrapnel fragments, which could not be safely removed at this point, but could be managed with appropriate pain medication and physical therapy. His hearing loss was documented. His blood pressure and heart function showed the strain of years of stress and poor nutrition, but were responding to treatment and better diet. He started on an updated medication plan designed to reduce nightmares and hypervigilance without the heavy sedation he had experienced with older medications decades earlier. He returned to the museum during daytime as a formal volunteer, this time recognized and properly registered. He assisted Jake and other mechanics with the M60 and other vehicles in the collection, explaining maintenance procedures in clear instructional terms. He avoided drama, but provided precise technical knowledge. Jake proved an attentive student, his earlier arrogance replaced with genuine respect and eagerness to learn from someone with decades more experience. 6 months later, Hank's appearance and circumstances had changed substantially. His hair was better trimmed, still kept in a military short style, but even and clean. His clothes fit properly, replaced through a combination of VA vouchers and donations coordinated through the housing program. He still walked with the same limp from his knee, but his movement was more confident, less restricted by pain now that it was properly managed. He lived in a small studio apartment arranged through a veterans housing assistance program. Modest space with a bed, table, chair, small kitchenette, and bathroom. A shelf held his spiral notebook, dog tags, photographs, and now also technical manuals about armored vehicles that Colonel Reyes had given him. He continued weekly therapy at the VA, still resistant to discussing certain topics, but gradually expanding what he was willing to address. Nights were not free of nightmares. He still woke sometimes with his heart racing, momentarily convinced he was back in the turret, but their intensity and frequency had lessened measurably. He had fewer episodes of waking completely disoriented or experiencing panic flashbacks triggered by loud noises.